So it's wonderful to be able to welcome so many people here into the Jubilee Room in the New South Wales Parliament, the mother parliament of Australia. And I think anyone that serves here is very proud of that history that we have here, including my friends from the Legislative Council, which was the first parliament in Australia just 101 years ago, 201 years ago. I know, I failed math. But the Treasurer is there and he corrected me. Okay, so it was 201 years ago, so I fully acknowledge the significance of the Legislative Council. It's wonderful to be able to be here and to say a few words of welcome here into this magnificent room, the Jubilee Room. The title, Parliament Unpacked, the Dismissal 50 Years On. Daniela and the team doing these programs of Parliament Unpacked bring to life so many wonderful moments in the history of New South Wales. Of course, we have a special guest who you'll be hearing from soon. And I won't be staying for the rest of the event, but it is wonderful to be here. So it's a significant day for a number of reasons. Okay, it's Remembrance Day, the 11th of the 11th, and that was a very it's a poignant day for so many, obviously around Australia, but here in New South Wales, where we actually had a number of members of Parliament who went to war. We have two from the Legislative Assembly who we recognised, and recognised this recently, their deaths. Edward Larkin, the member for Willoughby, George Braun, who was the member for Armidale at the time. So it's a poignant moment, a significant dot point in the history of New South Wales. But so were some other matters, and we all probably took a great interest in what happened with the dismissal, the dismissal of the Whitlam government at the time 50 years ago. But I understand you're going beyond that to one of my favourite premiers of all time. Not giving it away, are we? The Honourable Jack Lang, who an extraordinary player in New South Wales politics, and whether you support Labor politics as it was at the time or whatever, doesn't matter. It is undeniable the impact, the influence of somebody like Jack Lang on the fabric of New South Wales and indeed across Australia. So I hope you have a fabulous time here. I'm sure it's going to be very entertaining, and it's wonderful to, as I say, be here and for you to have the honour and pleasure of having the intellect of the Honourable Daniel Mookhey here, as well as the Treasurer of New South Wales. So with that, I shall pass over to you, Daniela, and thank you all very much. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to just quickly introduce our panel members that we have for tonight. And I must say that it is a great gift when you're organising a evening like this to be gifted with such a great panel. We have Professor Rodney Smith, who is Professor of Australian Politics at the University of Sydney, and he primarily teaches Australian politics and public sector ethics and corruption. His current research interests are trust and mistrust in Australian politics, Australian political parties, parliaments and elections, political ethics and corruption, and comparative federalism, one of my favourite topics. Dr. Lynsey Blayden from the University of Sydney Law School teaches in federal constitutional law and public law. She researches conceptions of the state and democracy within the Australian Constitution and the role of institutions in sustaining social and political well-being. She has previously worked for the New South Wales Parliamentary Library Research Service, one of my favourite organisations, and the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet. And we have as our special guest speaker the Honourable Daniel Mookhey, who is a member of the Legislative Council, and you heard the bells before and you will hear them again, and the Treasurer, and he's also New South Wales Treasurer, and he may have to leave if those bells go. He's a member of the Australian Labor Party. He was elected to the Legislative Council in 2015 to a vacancy caused by the resignation of Steve Wan. He was Shadow Treasurer prior to 2023 and has also chaired and served on a variety of parliamentary committees. So thank you, all three of you. Can we give them a welcome applause? So tonight, as Mr Speaker mentioned, from a perspective half a century on, we're going to discuss the constitutional crises of 1975. And I wanted to list all of the other things that happened in 1975, but I would rather go on to my panel and ask them questions. But I must say one thing though. Does anybody know what the number one hit single was in 1975? Clue by Captain and Tennille. Yes? Close. Love Will Keep Us Together, which obviously didn't work for the federal parliament. There's also been a very exciting lead up to the 50th anniversary in the media. The dismissal is absolutely everywhere. My favourite documentary was the ABC's I Was Actually There, where they interviewed witnesses. I'm sure most people saw it. And a young, now 60-year-old man who was there in Year 5 on a school tour of Parliament on that day, saw the whole thing. Now, as you know, tonight we'll also touch on the events of 1932. So I was very pleased when my colleague pointed out, I don't know if anybody reads John Menadue's Pearls and Irritations. He was the head of the Prime Minister's department in 1975, and he said, quote, David Smith, the official secretary at Government House, rang and told me that the Whitlam government had been dismissed. Whitlam's driver then rang me and told me that the boss wanted to see me urgently. I drove immediately to the lodge. Gough was at the table eating a steak. He said, Comrade, the bastard cur has done a game on me. And so a New South Wales perspective was embedded into the history of the 1975 constitutional crisis, and thus our themes for tonight. Thank you very much, the three of you. So shall we begin with some questions? I first wanted to ask each of you to tell us, perhaps, introduce yourself a little bit more than what I just did, and tell us what your interest in this topic today is. And I might start with the Treasurer.
Thank you. Can I firstly acknowledge that we are on the land of the Gadigal and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging? Can I say hello to my fellow panellists and congratulate the Parliamentary Education team, and hello to everybody who's watching and who's here in the room. I find that you come to the story of the dismissal either by one of principally two routes. The first is love or hate of Gough Whitlam. Second is love or hate of the Australian Constitution. I came through both. Both. I was born in 1982, 7 years after the dismissal, but Gough Whitlam loomed very large because if it wasn't for him, my family never could have come to Australia. My parents are from India. Gough Whitlam was the one who removed the vestiges of the White Australia policy that allowed Australian Indian migration. So my father came here in 73. And my father, who died when I was very young, was an ardent Whitlam fan. Incidentally, Richard Nixon as well. So you careful of the judgment, but one of the two was correct. And so I took a great interest in sort of Labor politics from a very young age. And when in the 90s, the figure that everyone was thinking about was Gough, but the people who everyone was watching was Bob and Paul. And that was how I grew up in my background. So I, as a very nerdy teenager, spent an inordinate amount of time reading about Gough. Because for me, 1995, the 20th anniversary, was when I was in Year 7. And that's when I got the books. That's when I got to the library. Paul Kelly published a book at the time called The Dismissal, which was an update of his earlier version, which was called The Unmaking of Gough, and he updated that. And so I just loved this text, and I got into it incredibly on both the character of Gough Whitlam and, of course, the history of the dismissal itself. And I learned from that a few things. Firstly, that Gough Whitlam will never be seen again in Australian politics, a figure that transformative, good or bad. Secondly, that constitutional crisis should never be seen again. And the third element is, and now as a New South Wales parliamentarian that sits in the Legislative Council, the element that has caused me to take more interest recently than before is what I would describe as the disgrace of the New South Wales Parliament. Because the part of the dismissal that often is overlooked is the manipulation of the Senate that took place prior to it. And that is, here in this place, just over there, the Lewis government convened a joint sitting to replace a senator that replaced a Labor senator with a non-Labor senator. which incidentally gave rise to some of the best political theatre that this parliament has ever seen, with Neville Wran as the then leader of the opposition, staging the filibuster and staging an epic debate to utterly humiliate the short-lived premiership of Tom Lewis, to bring down effectively the Lewis government. He was a premier for maybe 4 months, and he will only be remembered really for this. And if it wasn't for this decision of this parliament to alter the numbers of the Senate, and the equivalent decision by Joe Bjelke-Petersen, the dismissal never would have happened. And sitting now as a legislative councillor in the same place in which that took place is an opportunity to be in the place where a lot of history has been made. And at the 50th anniversary, the reason why I always relish the prospect of joining is that I've been waiting for an event like this for 25 years. And I can now speak at it as a person who has sat there and watched us replace senator after senator after senator as well. So I'm thrilled to be here. That's my Gough Whitlam story. I can tell you about when I met Gough, but I probably would divert a bit too much. It was a great time. But I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the dismissal, and I'm really glad that I've gotten that off the chest. Gough said, maintain your rage, and I've maintained my rage against the Lewis government for 50 years. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Lynsey.
Thank you. So just excuse my attack of allergies right as I'm about to speak. Thank you. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to follow that answer with that degree of passion, but I mean, it's really hard to escape an interest in these both events, I think. And I think have too many of my own reasons to name. So in the interest of trying to be crisp, I'll just say that I think that the events and the characters involved in both dismissals have this sort of Shakespearean quality, which just make them endlessly human and fascinating. So, as I said, hard to escape fascination with both events, I think.
Rodney.
Well, I remember the dismissal. I was in grade 10 in a suburban high school, state high school in Brisbane, and I was walking home with a friend of mine, Jimmy McClurg, and we had a little radio. We were listening, trying to make sense of it all. What does it all mean? And I'm not sure we did make too much sense of it, except to know, as I think people instinctively knew at that time, that you had to take a side. And so that continued when I was an undergraduate at University of Queensland. We learned from an academic point of view about the dismissal, but it was very clear that the professors then had sides, and they were very reluctant to give an inch to the other side. So it mirrored, in a sense, the politics of 1975. And as I've kind of developed in my academic career and look back on this event, I think I do see it with, hopefully, a little bit more subtlety than I did in 1975 itself. But it still is one of those, as is clear, it is the constitutional crisis, one of the few, certainly the greatest one we've had in Australia. And there's a lot to be thought about why, past 50 years we haven't had another constitutional crisis. So let's unpack some of that later on.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. That's really interesting. Now, I'm aware that the Treasurer will have to leave in a few minutes. So, Rodney, do you mind? I was going to ask you to give a general overview on how a Parliament with a majority of House of Representatives could be dismissed by the Governor. Do you mind giving us a little bit of that, and then, or shall we wait? We can go to the next question and come back.
No, I think that's important context,
Yeah.
and it kind of builds on what the Treasurer has just said around the replacement of the two casual vacancies. So late 1960, I'd like to say the late 1960s. So late 1960s, the Liberal Party was in government, but in conflict with itself. Succession of Prime Ministers after Menzies, and Labor saw its opportunity to win back government after a terrible defeat in 1966. Made up a lot of ground in 1969, but didn't win. See Don's Party by David Williamson, if you're interested in some of that. And then in 1972, got over the line in the House of Representatives, but because of the Senate election rules, faced a minority in the Senate. And then already this conflict is becoming very clear and being played out between the Senate and the House of Representatives, because the Labor Party controls one, the Liberal Country Party coalition control the other. And so in 1974, double dissolution, Labor loses a seat in the House of Representatives, but still has a majority. The Senate becomes, is still favourable to the Liberal Country Party coalition. And then that's added to by the actions of two state premiers in replacing Labor senators, Lionel Murphy in New South Wales and a Queensland senator whose name escapes me momentarily, with, in the case of New South Wales, an independent mayor, Cleaver Bunton, and in the case of Queensland, with a Labor member, but who was very much against Gough Whitlam, who became a Senator, Albert Field. They enter the Senate, although Albert Field, interestingly, doesn't stay there for long because there's a constitutional challenge against his eligibility to stand or to be a senator, foreshadowing events that took a lot of time in the 20-teens. So Labor's still in trouble. The conflict is still there. The coalition still has the numbers basically to defer supply, which it does on 3 occasions in October. Has to be said that Cleaver Bunton, the independent Tom Lewis's man, votes with Labor on the questions of supply, on the motions around supply. Field isn't in the chamber. The coalition doesn't give Labor a pair for Field, because officially Field is, after all, a Labor senator, so the coalition maintains its advantage and is able to press that to the point where Kerr, rightly or wrongly, steps in and dismisses the Whitlam government. So that's the kind of build-up as I see it in very broad brush terms. I mean, there are shelves of books on this, so there's lots more detail, but that's what I see as this kind of Shakespearean conflict with institutional powers that come into conflict as well.
And so money bills, appropriation bills, were such an important element in the dismissal. So I wonder, Lynsey, can we just focus on them for a few minutes before I ask the Treasurer, as the practitioner, about how he puts together a budget, and if 1975 ever impinges on his thinking while he does that. But Dr. Blayden, would you give us a background of the different systems for appropriation bills at both federal and state level, just so we know exactly what the issues were there?
Yeah, so thank you. So at state level, following sort of conflicts between both houses that had really been happening since the establishment of the bicameral parliament in the mid-19th century, in the 1930s, a provision was added to the state constitution, Section 5A, which effectively says that the upper house in New South Wales can't reject or refuse to vote on a money bill, and if it does do that, the lower house can simply present that bill to the governor and ask the governor to sign the bill into law. In contrast, Section 53 of the Commonwealth Constitution, it says that the Senate, money bills, they can't originate in the Senate, they can't be amended by the Senate, but it does leave the space for the Senate to refuse to vote on money bills, which is what it did in 1975. It also can send the bills back to the House of Representatives, asking that amendments be made to them. This is part of a compromise that was struck during the drafting of the Constitution around principles of federalism and principles of responsible government. And it wasn't, some at the convention debates in the 1890s did anticipate that this left the possibility for the Senate to potentially block supply to a government, but they appeared, those drafting the Constitution appeared to think that the principles of responsible government, in which governments are responsible to the lower house, would sort of assert themselves. And this was largely kind of forgotten and left in the Constitution in what Professor George Winterton called a ticking time bomb until the events of 1975, which was when it came to the fore, as Rodney has just explained.
So pretty much it couldn't ever happen. Treasurer, would you like to add to that?
Well, I do. I think it's a fantastic legal process of how we got here. But actually sitting behind these have been some epic political clashes that have happened here, that's happened incidentally in Westminster. The other part that has to be sort of told here is that had the nation federated in 1910, this wouldn't have happened. Because bear in mind, in 1909, there was a showdown by the Asquith government in the House of Lords that brought to an end the capacity of the House of Lords to reject money bills in Westminster. And had we then adopted the same constitutional principles, we wouldn't have had this issue because we would effectively have the House of Representatives in the same position as the House of Commons in Westminster. The reason why the states got this was because in 1931 we did the Dominions Act. And as part of the Dominions Act, by that point, this was the settled constitutional principle in Westminster, which meant that it then applied to the state domains here, which is our acts had to be consented to by the Mother Parliament, as did Canada's, as did the Dominions as well. So our constitution went through the House of Lords, House of Commons, and then this was therefore picked up, which means that couldn't happen here. Bear in mind, Jack Lang is quite an important part of that. Because this all takes place in the wake of the dismissal, Phil Game's decision to dismiss Jack Lang here. House of Commons also corrects him for that. For what it's worth, and this is the things you learned, there were 3 examples of this. I haven't checked recently, but Gough, Jack Lang, and the government of Jamaica got dismissed as well. And these were the 3 in which the use of the reserve powers effectively were triggered as well. In a practical sense, I find myself in a weird position where I'm a member of the Legislative Council who is invited to, because the budget needs to originate in the LA, so I'm brought in by invitation of the LA to present the budget bills, give the budget speech. I don't vote in the LA, obviously, and then I return to the LC, and then after the LA passes the budget, and listen to all my colleagues' opinion, none of which has any actual power. And I tend to find that in my good colleagues, with respect to them in the LC, and I'm a former shadow treasurer, so I've done the same, I would just say that I often find that people have very strong opinions on questions for which they have little power. And that is the nature of the debate. So you will see the budget move here in roughly 2 days through the New South Wales Parliament. Final point I should make is that Dr. Blayden rightly says that in the absence of the LC passing a state budget, the LA can transmit it to government for signature. That took place in 2021, where the LC was testing its ability as to what is actually an appropriation, what constitutes an appropriation and what constitutes other legislation. Anyway, the governor signed the bill and signed the 21-22 budget, which for the governor of the day, I'm sure was quite reassuring.
Fantastic. Could you tell us, Treasurer, as how you put a budget together and do you ever think of 1975 when you do?
I don't think of 1975 when I do, because we have a different constitution. But you're quite right to say that power to have a bill passed without needing the consent of the LC is a very important prerogative of an executive level government, in the ability to actually implement their mandate that's been given to them by the people. The budget is a major instrument of social and political and government organisation. But the second, I would say, is that it's also how the government is accountable to Parliament. Because appropriation bills can sound very technical, but at its core, it's Parliament deciding how the public's money can be spent legally and constitutionally, and that's a big deal. And therefore, the requirement for a government to show that it can get supply technically comes out of the Middle Ages when the Crown needed to be ensured that the Crown could pay the bills when the King kept launching wars and he needed to make sure that he could fund them. But actually it was an incredibly important determinant in the emergence of effectively a Westminster Prime Minister style executive government. And it's important. I mean, I take it very seriously that when we go and ask the Parliament to spend the public's money, that is not a small thing to do. The Consolidated Fund is by law the ability of the state to coerce contribution, is one way of describing it. Therefore, how do we do that legitimately and democratically and in a way which is answerable to the people? That is the whole concept of popular sovereignty, which sits in the lower house, which was the basis of Gough Whitlam rejecting the legitimacy of the Senate position, because his view is pretty fundamental. The House of Reps answers to the people. and his budget is an expression of their popular will.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering now, the Treasurer mentioned 1932 and the dismissal of Jack Lang. Let's move to that, and then we can come back and have a look at the impacts of both 75 and 1932 on now and on how we have dealt with our constitutional issues since. So, Rodney, would you be able to outline for us what Lang's impact was? We have mentioned a little bit of it on the New South Wales Legislative Council. So what did the council look like pre-Lang, and what did it look like after his reign?
His reign. So we're talking about, when we're talking about Lang, we're talking a long period really that he led the Labor Party, but he was Premier for two periods in the 1920s, 1925 to 1927 and 1930 to 1932, before he was dismissed by Sir Philip Game. So up to Lang, and including Lang, the council was a body made up of appointed members appointed by the Governor on the advice of the Premier. And so it kind of that, and there was no limit on the numbers. So in that kind of context, it became a bit of a battle of wills, how big the Legislative Council would grow and who would get to sit and be a member of the Legislative Council. Didn't have to go and face the people every 12 years, like
8 years.
Self.
Yep.
8 years, sorry, pardon me.
Yep.
That's right, it used to be 12 years.
Used to be 12.
Sorry.
They were the
8
days.
years, they were the days. You're appointed, you're in. So the council got bigger and bigger, but governors were not always happy to accede to the demands of premiers that they should increase the number of legislative councillors, particularly if it was thought they were just trying to swamp the council. In other words, put in enough of their own supporters to make sure they had a majority and could effectively use the council as a bit of a rubber stamp. So Lang famously, following Labor policy, taking it seriously, the Labor platform, more seriously than most of the other state premiers had done, said, let's abolish the Legislative Council. So he attempted to do this in his first premiership by appointing 25 new legislative councillors. There was a bit of toing and froing with the then governor, Dudley de Chair, who wasn't sure about this, consulted with London, and London said, well, he's the Premier, Lang's the Premier, you really ought to do what he's asking you to do, essentially. So Lang got his 25, very famously, a number of them jumped ship and thought, gee, it's kind of nice in this red leather, in these red leather seats, we might like to stay here. And so they voted down the proposal. The Suicide Squad sort of, some of them anyway, lost their nerve. Lang loses an election. There's a non-Labor government, and it basically does a couple of things. Well, the important thing it does is to entrench the council, and Leslie can say more about that. Lang gets back into power, and really his troubles in his second term aren't so much to do with the Legislative Council as to do with the other premiers, as to do with the Prime Ministers of the day, both Labor in the form of James Scullin and non-Labor in the form of Joe Lyons. The other premiers and the Commonwealth supporting a particular approach to the problem of basically raising money, keeping the economy going during the Depression, Lang favouring his own Lang plan. So it brings the two into conflict, and particularly over the issue of the repayment of loans to British banks, which Lang does his best to kind of defer and avoid from New South Wales' point of view. The Commonwealth, which is responsible ultimately for this, tries to extract the money, and so Lang ends up taking measures which become more and more kind of extreme, shall we say, until the governor, a new governor, Philip Game, who is still uncertain about what he should do, it confronts Lang, and basically in a meeting, I shouldn't say confronts Lang, has a meeting with Lang, apparently they got on reasonably well, has a meeting with Lang and says, look, is what you're doing legal? Because I've had advice it's not. Lang can't confirm that it is legal, and so on that basis it's Game who dismisses Lang. has to be said it's not got to do with the Legislative Council, because by this stage, Labor controls the Legislative Council. And that's shown by the fact that it gets one of the measures that it was trying to pass the Parliament to deal with the economic crisis. It gets it through the Parliament on I think it was the night before Lang has his meeting with Game. So it's not to do with the Legislative Council, unlike 1975. It's much more to do with the measures that Lang was taking and their legality. Game was reluctant to sack Lang. He was under a lot of pressure to do so. If you're interested in reading a very sympathetic account, but a good account of this dismissal of a Premier, contains a lot of that. He resisted that pressure for a long time. You can imagine a lot of Conservatives who he would mixed with said, get rid of this guy. He's ruining the joint, but he didn't until he was pushed into the position where he kind of thought, well, if this is illegal and I'm, giving assent to something that's illegal, I'm not really prepared to do that. So that's the.
So similarities and differences to 1975 and important ones.
Yeah. And then quickly, I've gone on, haven't I? Post Lang, another non-Labor government, coalition government, they reformed the Legislative Council, 60 members, a quarter of whom elected every 3 years by the existing members of the Parliament. So it's not a vote at large, it's not a vote of the public, it's a vote of the members of Parliament. So it's designed to give them control in a way. It's done by proportional representation, so the parties are proportionally represented, but if you think about it, replacing a quarter of them every 3 years, it's very slow, so it's still a conservative body in that sense. It changes much more slowly than public opinion as represented in the Legislative Assembly. That keeps going, cranks on until 1978 when the Rann government finally gives us, the people, the opportunity to elect the members of the Legislative Council, keeps some of that other model in play, 12-year terms, a third of the, I think I'm getting this right.
8-year terms, half the Parliament.
12-year terms in 1978.
Oh, yeah, that's right, it was changed
initially.
in 92.
And then it was changed later in 92 to be 8-year terms with half the Legislative Council elected at each election. So it's a long evolution, if you like, or with several periodic sort of changes in its shape. But certainly the Lang period was very important in moving it from a council where there was this kind of potential for conflict between the governor and the premier, battle of wills, to a more kind of, okay, you've got 60 and they're elected in a particular way, to then 1978, it's a popularly elected chamber. Yep.
Lynsey, did you want to add anything? And then I might ask the Treasurer if he wants to.
Well, if the
add
Treasurer
something.
needs to leave.
I've got to go in about 7 minutes.
Would you like to add something to the history of the council?
Look, this is like nerd heaven. Look, a couple of things there. Firstly, the issue in 32 was that the dismissal of Lang involved the first use of the reserve powers. And bear in mind, it was sort of at that point, it's still an open question as to whether the powers existed, which became a big subtext in 75, which is, did the powers survive the formation of a written constitution? Which is a problem that an Australian had to answer because we wrote down the constitution, which is in the UK, it's a very different question. And so the Lang episode 75 was, all right, we know the reserve powers exist in the view of illegality. And the governor or a monarch can dismiss a government if they disobey the law, which is still a very important principle, incidentally. And that does colour a lot of public policy in terms of how we as an executive, when we swear in, we are required as part of our commission to obviously obey the law. So that's what I find most interesting about the 32 episode from a constitutional sense. I should just say, Jack Lang is a predecessor of mine as Treasurer. And I should tell you that when you become Treasurer, the Treasury have not gotten over this. Because bear in mind that the colour and movement of this has got Jack Lang summoning a militia to raid the Treasury and take the money to ensure that it doesn't end up with the bondholders. And that's the spectacular political drama that is taking place throughout this. Philip Game, his character he's a UK banker sent in the Great Depression. Joe Lyons is a Labor turncoat. Interesting point of political trivia, the last Premier to become Prime Minister. No Premier has become Prime Minister since Joe Lyons, but he was a Labor Premier of Tasmania who effectively ends up as the leader of the Conservatives. It had all the same Shakespearean drama elements. Put it this way, and then of course Lang Labor then splits the Labor Party. There's two Labor parties in New South Wales. That then undermines sort of the war effort, incidentally. Jack Beazley, Lang Labor, brings down the Scullin government. It's quite... The cascading consequence of conflict are very unpredictable and great history.
And I love that Treasury still.
Oh, they still.
So do they walk past the Intercontinental like shivering?
Well,
That's where it
they will never say this, but the default is I asked when I became Treasurer, which is where have you kept the gold? And when can I get it?
Lynsey, did you want to add anything?
So yeah, it's such a consequential period in so many ways, and I think one of the things that happened in the kind of interregnum between the two Lang governments was the government of Bavin. They put a provision in the state constitution which said effectively that a bill to alter the character of the upper house or try to abolish the upper house would have to be submitted to the people at referendum. They drafted this very cleverly to apply the referendum procedure to the provision itself. And then when Lang came back into government, he thought he would have another go at trying to abolish the LC, as we've heard. He didn't put the bill that sought to do so to the people. And when there was an attempt to take this bill to the governor to be signed, members of the upper house, led by Trethowan, they sought an injunction in the Supreme Court preventing this bill becoming law. And then the Supreme Court of New South Wales and then the High Court by majority found that actually the Parliament of New South Wales is now bound by this procedure that's in the state constitution, section 7A, meaning that the Parliament can seek to abolish the upper house, but it can't do so unless the bill seeking to do that is put to the people in a referendum. And so the subsequent changes that happened to the Constitution, as the Treasurer pointed out, following the Lang government, and Rodney has already described them, and also Section 5A, which I referred to earlier, was put in post the second Lang government. These provisions, because they relate, some of them related to the constitution and powers of the Legislative Council, they had to be approved at a referendum in accordance with the procedure in Section 7A, as did the changes in 1978 that allowed the upper house to be finally directly elected in New South Wales.
Thank you. So it's a real tug of war then between the Legislative Council and the Executive. Treasurer, what's your view on that dynamic? It was quite conflict-ridden at the time. What's it been like since? What's it like now?
Well, I've learned that you enjoy the conflict more when you're in opposition than when you are in government. And as a leading practitioner of the LC's user of the LC's powers in opposition, and also as one of the people who's also now routinely subject to them, I know which one I prefer. And but look, it's an important part of our democracy that you are accountable to the upper house. We take it seriously as a government. At various points, it can be deeply infuriating or incredibly enlivening, depending on what's been discussed and how. Second issue is that what's been noticeable is that a lot more of executive government now comes from the LC, which was pretty unheard of in this era. That you would have a treasurer in the LC is something that took place when Michael Egan. He was the first. There's been 4 treasurers from the LC: Michael Egan, Michael Costa, Eric Roosendahl, and myself. But we have a lot of senior ministers that are in the LC. And it just alters the dimensions of our democracy as well. For what it's worth, I obviously support it. But it is helpful that you have senior ministers that are responsible in both houses. But the distinction is you're not responsible to both houses in the same way. Government is still formed in the lower house. The lower house remains the centre of our democracy. Governments answer to the will of the people in the lower house, not the upper house. The upper house has very important accountability functions, particularly as a house of review. And particularly in New South Wales, the house is very powerful in how it uses its common law powers, particularly to call for papers, far more than any other jurisdiction. And I would just observe... particularly in the last 2 parliaments, have reformed many of the procedures of the upper house, so it's much more efficient in its accountability function, which is why this parliament and the last parliament have been quite interesting. because you do see the upper house in a much more powerful form than you would if you were paying attention to South Australian politics, West Australian politics, Tasmanian politics, although to be fair, Tasmanian politics has been spectacular recently. And Queensland doesn't have one, because that is the one place where Labor did actually implement its platform to abolish upper houses. Final point is, my very first speech as a member of the LC, I called for the place to be abolished. So, so I maintain my reach.
I wasn't actually going to mention that. I was very tempted, so I'm glad you brought that up.
You're going to have to
yourself.
forgive me. I'm going to have to disappear to another function. But,
Thank you so
thank
much,
you.
Treasurer, for taking the time to be here tonight. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to actually hear from a practitioner in the House, a practitioner of the money bills and the appropriation bills. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to do a little bit of a wrap-up by thinking about the events of 1975 and indeed 1933. And as we all know, they generated a lot of opposing views and a lot of passion. This is what 50 years today we've been remembering and seeing again. I mean, apart from Norman Gunston, who managed to lighten things up a little bit, which was fantastic. But 50 years on, watching and rethinking about that, it made me think that Australia did avoid tumbling into a political abyss at the time and since. And so I'm wondering if the two of you could have a think, tell us a little bit, what were the lessons from the dismissal, and have they prevented us from having another similar crisis since? Did we learn to not go there again, or has that just been a coincidence? Rodney, did you want to have a go at answering that?
Yeah, well, maybe if I can start with the politics of that question. So, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the politics of the late 1960s to mid-late 1970s were extraordinarily combative between the two major party groupings. I mean, people think that politicians are rude to each other now, and probably they are, but if you go back to those times, there was just this incredible, I mean, I'm sure they all sort of shook hands afterwards or whatever, but there was this incredible antagonism. And that could have reoccurred. I think it didn't happen politically because of not necessarily an accident, but a set of events that might have turned out differently. First of all, after the December 1975 election, the new government under Malcolm Fraser had a big majority in the House of Representatives, massive majority, but also a majority in the Senate, big majority in the Senate. And that looked likely to continue. In fact, I was doing my homework for this talk, and Clem Lloyd and Andrew Clark, in a book that some of you may possess on your shelves, Kerr's King Hit, towards the end of that book, they make a prediction, and I just want to read it out because it's just leapt out of the page. Ruling out disintegration of the coalition or a disastrous administrative performance, the Fraser government had unparalleled opportunity to dominate Australian government for the rest of the century. With only moderate competence and imagination in government, it could stay in for many years. And part of that was because the way the Senate works, even if it gradually lost a few Senate seats, it would still have had a majority. So the first element is that big majority. So there wasn't an opportunity for Labor to do what, to be fair, Gough Whitlam had threatened the coalition government of the time that he would do, or his party would do in 1970, which was to use the Senate to block their supply bills and bring them down. So Labor may well have done that. Gough Whitlam was, of course, the leader of the opposition until 1977. But no chance of doing that. So you have one party dominating. Not good for parliamentary politics, but good if you're trying to avoid a repeat of the crisis. And then what happens, interestingly, is a section of the electorate, a section of the politicians decide we don't like this combativeness, and they form new political movements which become the Australian Democrats. It's not a majority movement by any means, it's maybe 10% of the population at most, but what it does mean is that the Senate changes. And so since 1981, no government, except for the last government of John Howard, has had a majority in the Senate. No government has had that. So governments have to look to either the opposition or to the crossbench to get their legislation through. Now, we're very familiar with that story now because it's part of the Senate story, and indeed the story in the Legislative Council, and has been in the Legislative Council since 1988, and the Senate, with that brief exception, since 1981. So the politics of it have changed, and they're not going to change back much as some of us might yearn for the good old days when it was a two-party contest, essentially, and nuisances like the Democrats and the Greens and One Nation and so on didn't exist. That's not going to happen. The electoral trends are just in completely the opposite direction. So a government will face a Senate that it doesn't control, or a Legislative Council it doesn't control, but it won't face one that the opposition controls, and that creates a very different dynamic, a more pluralist politics, in which there's more compromise, different options for forming small C coalitions to get legislation through the Parliament. So that's the political reason we haven't had that any repeat of 1975.
Yeah, that's a great overview of that context politically. Can we narrow in on constitutionally, Lynsey, what lesson then was taken?
So that's a really interesting question. And I think that it's, if you think about what happened in 1975, and it's been really interesting watching some of the commentary around it in the last few days, it wasn't only a constitutional crisis, or for some people even a constitutional crisis, it's a political crisis. The Commonwealth Constitution is broadly the same as what it was in 1975. There was one successful referendum to change the procedure for appointing senators where there's a casual vacancy to try to avoid what had occurred, as Rodney and the Treasurer spoke about earlier, in the lead up to the dismissal. So in terms of the lessons we can take from it, I think for me, it's to follow on a little bit from what Rodney was saying. I think if we think about both of these crises, what happens in the wake of both dismissals is that we have an election, and the electors of both New South Wales and the Commonwealth go out and they cast their ballots in the ordinary way, and they chose their governments. So while some people were perhaps justifiably angry at the events, this didn't create a kind of sense of alienation from the system so great that it led to sort of political violence, which, when you actually really think about the circumstances, particularly of 1932, in the kind of extremities of the Great Depression, it's possibly almost a little bit extraordinary in a way that's what happened. And so for me, I think that what we should probably think about is, what is it about our system that has in the past created this degree of civic trust that people, even in the wake of such extremity, still just go out and perform their own duty as citizens, which is casting their votes? And what might be the current kind of risks to that type of situation where we do have enough civic engagement and public trust to make sure that still occurs if a crisis such as this was to arise again? And to do some thinking about what might be some current threats to that in our system, I think. But to me, those are the sort of real lessons of both, not just the 1975 period, even though that's the one that's more immediate for us all tonight, but also the earlier dismissal of Lang in 1972.
Thank you both. So important, particularly as across the media we hear, democracy is broken, what's happening with democracy. It's so important to have a look at these historical events and see where we were in the past and how we dealt with that, and look at how we can deal with these things now. Now, we've got some time, and so I'm hoping people in the audience might have a couple of questions.
So, Jeremy Travers, Lang was actually warned by Game that he would be dismissed if he continued to break the law. That was something that was missing in the Whitlam example. Should the power to dismiss only be exercised after the Crown has warned the Chief Minister that is what is in his mind? Because Badgett does say that the Crown does have the right to warn, consult and advise. Should the power only be exercised after warning has been given?
It sounds like it sounds like we're in agreement, though. I mean, that is absolutely correct. Sir Philip Game did warn Jack Lang and gave him a chance to respond. That was absent in the conduct of Sir John Kerr in 1975, and even people who defend the use of reserve powers, given the context of the supply crisis in 1975, would agree I would say most people agree that Sir John Kerr absolutely should have warned Gough Whitlam before he dismissed him.
Terrific, thank you. And the question at the back?
Thank you. My name is Bill Apter. I suspect my question is initially for Dr. Smith, but I'm happy to be dealt with by any of you. It seems to me from the explanation you've given as to why the 75 dismissal hasn't been repeated, it's more a function of electoral politics rather than any fundamental revision or change in party position on how the dismissal and the reserve powers have been treated. That to me then suggests that if the serpent is still coiled at the table in 1901 and it was there in 75, it's still there now. So it's only a function of electoral politics that stops the problem recurring. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think that is fair, because as Lynsey said, the constitutional situation remains the same, pretty much the same, apart from the casual vacancies, which is an important element. But yeah, no, it's that I guess that's the point I'm making, that the political landscape in terms of the party landscape as represented in the parliaments of Australia has changed. I don't see it changing back. I can't see either side of politics consolidating enough support, by either side I mean either of the two major party groupings, consolidating enough support to dominate the Senate. And you can see that now. I mean, the coalition party's in all sorts of trouble nationally, but Labor's support is not, is nowhere near in a position where it's going to win a majority in the Senate. So yeah, it's electoral politics, as it was electoral politics in part that set up the problem in 1975. If the electoral outcomes had been slightly different, if Labor had got, what would it be, 2 more seats, if Lionel Murphy hadn't gone off to the High Court and created the casual vacancy, if the Queensland Labor senator hadn't passed away accidentally, then not deliberately. Pardon me, I put that badly, didn't I? If he hadn't passed away, then the circumstances may have been different as well. So, but I think fundamentally, the politics have changed, yes, and they're not changing back.
Lynsey, did you want to add anything?
Oh, no, not really. I think that's kind of why I wanted to talk about the fact that the kind of political culture that surrounds the Constitution is so important to its function, because all constitutions will have those types of gaps and imperfections. Mm-hmm. Constitutions are an amalgam of law and politics, and it's really hard to make the law such that it can control the politics. Where people are minded to take politics to extremes, they are going to do that, and that's why it's so important to make sure that the rest of the supports that sit around the Constitution and the way we all feel about our own role as people within the Constitution is really a critical element to its function.
Terrific, thank you. Great questions.
Thank you. My name's John. I just wanted to raise, obviously something that's going on in the world at the moment is the most powerful state in the world is going through its own supply crisis that's very protracted. I think it's been going on for a few months. Obviously, the government shutdown in the US. I wonder if there's any reflections on the strength of our own constitution. And I find it very ironic that we just recently had a no kings protest in the US, whereas we see in the US an executive system of government that is actually very monarchical, very kingly, whereas what sort of gets me excited about our system is, as we saw in 1975, the executive didn't just rest in whoever happened to be elected at the time. There was that sort of constitutional backstop, that emergency ejector seat to stop us having a long protracted supply crisis.
Thank you. I guess, did you want to comment?
I can comment, I guess. Yeah, well, it's the difference between a parliamentary system and a presidential system. And I think, again, it's in some ways an accident of history that the United States traditions and United States independence comes earlier when the Crown has more power over the Parliament than is the case when in the 1855, 1854, 1855, we start having, directly elected bicameral parliaments in Australia. So it's partly an accident of history, and therefore the dynamics of a supply crisis are going to be different in those circumstances, in those two different circumstances. But as to whether one is better than the other, I have views on that, but they're probably too complex to elaborate here. But I like you, I'm excited by the fact that executives don't have as much power as they do in certain other systems in the world.
Lynsey, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's such a. I have a lot of views myself too, and I think it's such an interesting contrast. Even the fact that, and I know it's slightly off your point, but the fact that in the US they're prepared to allow their government to be shut down for what has it been, like 40 days or something like that, whereas here it was absolutely critical. It was thought that was not allowed to happen, and part of the kind of pressure around the timing of when Whitlam was dismissed was about making sure there could be an election before Christmas to make sure supply could be secured once again, because it was just considered that it would be a complete disaster to allow the government to run out of money like that, and then for public servants to not be paid and so on. So there's something very, again, cultural going on that's part of the constitutional framing that you're talking about, but I think it's much more deeper as well.
My name's Teresa. This is a question for both Dr. Blayden and Professor Smith. As academics, what are your thoughts on the circumstances under which the Palace letters were released? And if we have time, maybe your thoughts on the contents of the Palace letters as well?
That's one for you, I think.
So I think it's good that they were. I mean, I'm a firm believer in accountability around these things, public accountability. So it's important that we are able to understand what these documents say. The things that are held in the National Archives, they do belong to the people of Australia ultimately, so we should be able to see what they contain. I mean, I guess here it is a difficult one, because it almost takes me back to where Professor Smith started, which is that, when you first come to this and think about what happened, you do tend, I agree, that you tend to take quite an extreme view on the situation, but then the more you start to think about the events and the circumstances, the more you start to see that there is this kind of great complexity around what was going on. And I mean, obviously, the kind of involvement of the vice-regal officer in these events did lead to a push for a republic, so you can kind of see how that did certainly help to feed into that push. So you can see how people tended to feel about this issue, but I do think it's a very complex one, actually. So, yeah.
In fact, the more we find out, the more complex
the
perhaps
more, exactly,
it gets, the more information that we get. Thank you for both those questions. I think we have time for one more question, if we've got one up here.
William Brazier. Kind of cut into the chase with this question. In his statement of reasons accompanying his decision, Sir John said that he could not permit a Prime Minister to govern if he could not obtain supply and would not resign. The question is simply this. Do you think he had that power, and do you think he was right to exercise it?
Thank you.
It's a constitutional question, isn't it?
So he had the power. The Governor-General does have reserve powers, and they can be exercised in certain circumstances. Reserve powers are powers that, unlike the rest of the powers that the Governor-General holds, can be exercised without advice the rest of the time. The Governor-General, is mentioned a lot more in our Constitution than the Prime Minister is, who's not mentioned at all, for example. So the Governor-General has a lot of formal powers in the Constitution, but the convention is that they are all exercised only on advice. reserve powers can be exercised when in certain particular circumstances. So the really difficult question around 1975 is not so much whether the power existed, but whether it was used appropriately in the circumstances. And that is a very difficult one to answer, because I think it tends to be, the stance people take on that tends to be informed by their stance on a whole range of other issues. For me, I think it's so obviously in the wake of the dismissal, really the kind of fallout from it, I think, fell most heavily on Sir John Kerr. And there's a great quote about reserve powers, that they're the kind of ultimate weapon, but one which, if used, is liable to turn upon the person who uses it. And I think there's a whole range of instances where you can be critical of the way in which the reserve power was exercised in 1975. But something that I always come back to is, I think, imagine if you were the one that is in this position and have to make this decision, you know? And I think it's an incredibly difficult decision to have to make, because if Whitlam's only solution to the supply crisis was a half-Senate election, he went to the Governor-General on the 11th of November 1975 ready to advise that a half-Senate election be called, but it's very questionable as to whether or not that was going to break the deadlock. So I think if you think about a situation where no one's budging, everyone's engaging in political brinkmanship, I think this is why I feel like, well, at least speaking for myself, the really important thing is making sure we tend to our politics to make sure that that type of political conduct isn't regarded as something that would be rewarded, for example. And even though Fraser did win in a landslide, I think, and perhaps Rodney would have something to say about this maybe, but it seems to me that tends to be regarded as not a statement from the people that they were happy with the exercise of their reserve powers as such, but more about the kind of, I guess, more a verdict on the government and the various things that had been happening in the government and what had been going on, rather than being about an endorsement of the actual dismissal.
Oh yeah, I think that's right. And I think, in fact, that was one of the difficulties that the Labor Party had in that election campaign, was that, in a sense, it was prosecuting its right to govern because it had a majority, held a majority in the House of Representatives against an opposition that was basically saying, you know, yeah, you govern, but you govern really badly. And unlike most people in this room, most Australians are not that interested in constitutional niceties. We know from experience and from, you know, when you ask random samples of Australians what's in the Constitution, what's not, they're not particularly au fait with what is and isn't. What they are concerned about, by and large, is much more jobs, you know, housing, all the sorts of inflation, etc., all the sorts of things that dominate in the news. So maybe that's I mean, leading from one of Lynsey's points, maybe that's one of the failings of our political culture, is this lack of understanding of some of our key institutions, including parliaments and the way parliaments operate. You know, I think that's a conundrum that's very difficult to work out how to effectively deal with, because, you know, despite kind of efforts like this, it's hard, and education programs more generally, it's really hard to kind of get across some of the kind of limitations that exist on political actors and some of the pressures on them. And it's much easier to sort of think, oh, they're just bad people or they're good people. That's a much easier kind of judgment to make, but it's not a particularly helpful one when it comes to crises, because, you know, it's not just a matter of who's good or bad, it's a matter of what the rules say, it's a matter of how they're being manipulated or attempted to be manipulated. They're going to be ambiguous in places that are often quite critical. So, you know, I think one of the key things that comes out of 1975 also is, and that we haven't really addressed, is this issue of political education or civic education in Australia.
Thank you. Look, that brings us, I think, to the end of the evening. As I look at the clock, let's draw the discussion to a close. And I'd really like to thank our two panellists for their thoughtfulness and their time and their knowledge and bringing that to us. So please, let's give them a round of applause.